I'm Andrew Natsius, the director of the Scowcroft Institute of International Affairs at the Bush School of Government here at Texas A&M University. I'd like to welcome you this evening to our final event this school year. Of course, graduation's upon us. I taught my last class yesterday. I'm not relieved yet because I have to give the final exam and then I have to correct them all in the final papers. So we're all the professors are in the most difficult part of the year, which is correcting everything. Ana Palacio, who I've known for many years now, we taught at Georgetown together. She is an adjunct, and I was on the regular faculty there. This was before I came to Texas A&M, so I've known her for a number of years now. She is an international lawyer specializing in international and European Union law. From 1994 to 2002, for 8 years, she was a member of the European Parliament, where she chaired the Legal Affairs and Internal Market Committee, as well as the Committee on Citizens' Rights, Justice, and Home Affairs. She served as the Foreign Minister of Spain under Prime Minister Aznar, who, by the way, was very close to President Bush. We were discussing who were the closest to President Bush. It was Tony Blair, Prime Minister of Great Britain, Rasmussen, the Prime Minister of Denmark, and Aznar, the Prime Minister of Spain. They were the closest friends and allies of the president, and so Ana was very close to Colin Powell and worked with him and with Condi Rice when she was National Security Advisor. So she served from 2002 to 2004 as the Foreign Minister of Spain, and then she was a member of the Spanish Parliament from 2004 to 2006, where she chaired the Joint Committee of the two houses for the European Union Affairs. She has been a Senior Vice President and General Counsel of the World Bank and the Secretary General of ICSID from 2006 to 2008. She has been a member of the Executive Committee and the Senior Vice President for International Affairs at Arriva, and served on the Council of State of Spain from 2012 to 2018. I could go through all of the think tanks and boards she's on, but one that's well known in the United States is the Atlantic Council, and I mentioned the Atlantic Council because there was a Scowcroft Center there as opposed to the Scowcroft Institute. Both of us are named after, of course, Brent Scowcroft, but we're sort of sister institutes. She sits on the Council of Foreign Relations for Europe. She, as I said before, is a visiting professor at the Edmund School of Foreign Service at Georgetown, and she maintains a monthly column at Project Syndicate and is a recurrent participant and speaker at many international conferences. Please join me in welcoming Ana Palacio.
Well, what a pleasure it is to be with you today. And I must say that it's an honor to be speaking at this close to the Bush 41 library and in an institution that is named after General Scowcroft, whom I have the pleasure to have met at the Atlantic Council, precisely, and work with. But first and foremost, my heartfelt gratitude to you, Andrew Natsios, and to the entire Scowcroft Institute for having me, and yes, also to you for attending. Today, any discussion about the expansive field of international relations has to begin by talking about Ukraine, not just because it is in our hearts and minds, although this is also true, but rather because we are witnesses in Ukraine represents a watershed moment, a before and after in the construction of our global architecture. In Europe, we have experienced different crushing crises since the fall of the Berlin Wall, from the calamity of Brexit to migration, economy, and financial debacles. However, what we are witnessing today is of existential nature. The world before Russia's aggression on February 24 was, as described by the title of a fundamental memoir of a European of the 20th century, The World of Yesterday. The world of tomorrow is already taking shape, and we are going to see into it. Seen from the other side of the pond, this date, 24th February, represents a turning point in several key areas: transatlantic relations, NATO, the cohesion of the European Union, the protagonism of security and energy, and Europeans' connection with core values. Let's go through it briefly. I will start with the transatlantic relations. Transatlantic ties have held together the fabric of our post-war reality, a reality sketched against the backdrop of the white crosses that dot the landscape of Normandy. Our cooperation has been solidified by institutions, treaties, joint actions, and common purpose under US leadership. US, the indispensable nation, as the late Madeleine Albright so rotundly and accurately portrayed America. This was true from a US perspective until the Trump administration. The 45th president's inward focus and nationalistic rhetoric left European allies questioning the reliability and dependability of the US. The trust which had carefully been built over half a century evaporated. America had, once again, developed tunnel vision in foreign policy and was unable to look beyond the Indo-Pacific, concretely beyond its rivalry with China. This opinion has only been reassessed since precisely the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Second, the vitality of NATO. Although French President Emmanuel Macron's valoration of the brain death of NATO may have been harsh and superfluous, it is true that the alliance was no longer fit for purpose. It lacked a clear sense of direction and meaning in the post-Cold War world. Case in point, the draft for the strategic concept, which is the organization's 10-year vision, circulating 6 months ago, were centered around topics like NATO's diversity policy and climate change, areas that, notwithstanding their relevance, cannot constitute the backbone of projected action in security. The crisis in Ukraine has breathed new life into the alliance. Sweden and Finland, traditionally neutral countries, are knocking on the door to request membership, and this is symbolic of this newfound vigor. Third, for the European Union, both at national and Brussels level, the robustness and swiftness with which we have acted so far, we Europeans, and the unity we have shown in doing so, has surprised both friends and foes. It is likely that Putin was expecting Europe to respond, or really not to respond, as it did in 2014 after the annexation of Crimea. Being candid, we have even surprised ourselves. Within the European Union, two areas that will define the immediate future of our common endeavor have surfaced. Security is paramount, and then energy. Security has understandably been brought to the forefront in light of the war in Ukraine, and I will briefly address this later. As for energy, gas, and therefore power, are leading the spike in commodity prices, which has clear repercussions for security. Logistic disruptions specifically increase the fragility of entire regions. An example would be grain shortages and rising costs and their destabilizing potential in Africa that I was discussing yesterday with Professor Natsios. This compounding of elements and the accompanying risk of spiraling inflation is shaking the economic status quo. But energy is the real protagonist of the present situation. Over the past few years, we had seen energy via its corollary, the sustainability, taking center stage in the European Union, where the ideological nature of the climate change debate has been on full display. Display. In 2007, the European Union launched its Energy Union, a balancing act of three fundamental objectives: security, affordability, and sustainability. However, with the inauguration of the von der Leyen, this commission, in in 2019, the balance was thrown off. Efforts became exclusively focused on the Green Deal, designed to be all-encompassing, shaping areas such as agriculture through the renowned farm-to-fork strategy, and encroaching on disparate subjects like cryptocurrency. Can you imagine cryptocurrency legislation? From this point on, energy security was taken for granted. Affordability was no longer considered. All this was supported by European Union's ambitious promise of an almost immediate transition to 100% renewables, promoted as no pain, all gain transformation. The invasion of Ukraine has shattered this mirage. Lastly, in renewing European society's connection with values and tradition, both individual heroism and the collective unwavering patriotism that Ukrainians are showing has an epic grandeur. It is the classic tale of David against Goliath, the courage displayed by Ukraine in facing a much bigger, better endowed, and more trained army, at least theoretically it was, will be ingrained into European history. It has the breadth and depth that inspired the Iliad, the Odyssey, La Chanson de Roland, El Cantar del Mio Cid, or closer to us and hopefully a little more relatable for you, young generation, Casablanca, or the bridge on the River Kwai. In our post-national, post-modern, post-structural European societies, where the economic dimension had come to supersede all others, we had lost sight of the power of patriotism, the fighting for your land and freedom, for your culture and agency. Faced with the bravery and valor of Ukrainians, Europeans have reconnected with a forgotten sense of pride. Each of these subjects could be the topic of an entire conference, and I must admit that it has not been easy to refrain from delving deeper into each of them. However, I have chosen to use today's session to undertake a broader, more comprehensive analysis of the current geopolitical landscape using Ukraine as a prism. Because Ukrainians are fighting our fight. Our future, the future of the West and the international liberal order on which it's rooted. This future is on the line. I will start with a dive into the war in Ukraine, its significance and implications. We will then take stock of how we got here to finally sketch what the future of the world order or disorder may look like based on 5 emerging groups of actors. Analysis of the current geopolitical landscape. As already mentioned, the conflict in Ukraine has been a catalyst to dynamics and tensions which had been building, even if we prefer to look the other way. We find ourselves at a crucial inflection point. And this is true regardless of whether Putin chooses to utilize May 9th, victory date of their great patriotic war, to escalate the crisis as Western analysts have predicted, in spite of the Kremlin's silence surrounding this topic. Although there have been dozens of wars in the nearly 80 years since World War II ended, the invasion of Ukraine has a differential transcendence. This aggression by the Kremlin seeks to redraw the security architecture in Europe. It is an example of long-standing Russian revisionism that we mistakenly thought was in the past, of an ambition to return to empires and areas of influence. It is an attack on the foundations that underpin our values and our place in the world. This is not just about Ukraine. Putin wants to reverse the clock. The Russian leader has made known his admiration for the greatness of the Tsars, who identifies security with territorial control. Maybe you know, but in the Russian Empire's last 400 years, it grew on average by 50 square kilometers a day. According to this delusional justification of aggression, it follows that a democratic, prosperous Ukraine integrated in the West would represent a dangerous counterpoint to Moscow's system of government. Although pundits are echoing Putin's narrative that NATO enlargement was an immediate trigger of the war, and not just pundits, other responsible of the Pope Francis was surprisingly on this line. Well, this explanation is absolutely reductionist, beyond the fact that such thinking dismisses the principles of sovereignty and denies agencies for countries who happen to border empires. It also fails to account for the determinism of Russia's self-proclaimed messianic and civilizational mission. In this context, it is revealing that the Russian Orthodox Church itself is weighing in by lending a spiritual basis and an almost metaphysical dimension of the war, with Orthodox leader Patriarch Kirill framing the war as struggle between good Putin and evil us. But even before the invasion of Ukraine sought to disrupt the multilateral order, a shift in the global balance of rules and power in favor of the latter had been taking shape for a while. The past decade saw multiple failures of multilateralism and cooperation, which exposed deep fractures within the post-war order, from the financial crisis and COVID pandemic to armed conflicts in which geopolitical tensions played out on third-party soil, such as in Syria, to systemic challenges by non-traditional actors. One of the clearest examples of such a challenge was executed by none other than Moscow with its annexation of Crimea and support for separatists in the Donbass in 2014. But beyond the West's condemnation of Russia in international organizations and some token sanctions, our response was muted. We did not want to see the implications for the shifting global order. In immediate terms, we are now entering a new period of greater insecurity where NATO's eastern flank is the main, but not the only, theater of operation. We are at war with Putin's regime, and this conflict will last far longer than the fighting in Ukraine, nor it will be contained by land borders. The Sahel, with its low-cost version of the Wagner army of Russian mercenaries, and Venezuela are but two examples. Fundamentally, the Indo-Pacific and the Euro-Atlantic theaters are now connected. We are confronted with open aggression from Russia with the tacit support of its key ally, the revisionist China, that is set up on prevailing in its rivalry with the US. Altogether, we are going to face more consequential and direct challenges, more uncertainty, and systemic instability undermining the very foundation of the world order. Beyond this consideration, this crisis has demonstrated that our adversaries understand the West better than we understand them and their strategic intentions, and perhaps even better than we understand ourselves. So, how did we get here? Well, we are in this post-Atlantic charter world. Let's take a step back. The rules-based international order that has been dominant since the mid-20th century is the brainchild of the West, of American leadership, with the Atlantic Charter as its cornerstone. Signed in the throes of World War II by President Franklin Roosevelt and Prime Minister Winston Churchill, the Charter outlines their prescient vision to build peace in the post-war world. If you have not read the text, I highly encourage you to do so. You will be captivated by the ambition of the stage goals, that all, and I'm quoting, all the men in all the lands may live out their lives in freedom, for fear and want. And it goes on to speak of the enjoyment by all states, great or small, victor or vanquished, of economic prosperity. This universality was key to the creation of a lasting world order. The integration of foes and adversaries defined in Bretton Woods or through the San Francisco Charter, and later exemplified in 2001 by China's inclusion in the World Trade Organization, is characteristic of this system, built on the correlation between economic prosperity and peace that held true for decades. Today, we find ourselves in a completely new context where peace and economic interdependence, globalization, are both decreasing and decoupling. In hindsight, this decoupling occurred earlier. However, for the purpose of our conversation, it is particularly relevant how, in the aftermath of 1989, much to the West's chagrin, Russia did not follow the path of post-war Germany, mirroring, if anything, the Weimar Republic in the interwar period. The economic chaos of the 90s left an indelible mark on the Russian psyche and is conventionally attributed by the Kremlin to the West's determination to, and I'm quoting, bring Moscow to its knees. The collapse of the Russian system and the ensuing collapse of its economy was shocking. It surprised the world, but also the country's citizens. However, Moscow's historic ambition, which dates back to Peter the Great, did not fall with this situation. Russians and their leader, with Putin championing the cause, believe it is the destiny of their country to be a great power. And objectively, Russia could and should be a great power. States become great powers through a combination of political, social, economic, military, and geographic and geographic assets. In addition to having the greatest geographical expansion, Russia has nearly 100% literacy rate, is one of the richest countries in terms of natural resources, and is backed by a long history of imperial prowess. And notwithstanding the disastrous performance we are witnessing, it will significant military might, bolstered by its 9,000 nuclear heads. All that is missing is the political dimension. Moscow's knowing that it could be or should be a great power makes it continue downward spiral all the more painful and fuels the fire of vengeance among the population. Geopolitical mutation. It also affects its relations to other actors. Although interstate relations are constantly in flux, the geopolitical mutation of today is especially striking. For this reason, it is beneficial to conduct a tour de table on the 5 key groups of players which are emerging, their calculus and their trajectories: the standard bearer, the ambivalent leader, the strategist of disruption, the smooth operator, and the system renewer. First, the standard bearer. Long the theater of bloody conflicts which have shaped the current international system, Europe is the logical place to start. A construction in law and by law, the European Union has been a key champion of the post-1945 rules-based order. Our support for a system rooted in rules has informed our efforts to become a values-based regulatory superpower, a kind of world referee cum player. However, our inclination to operate by the book has often led to an approach which could be described as fence-sitting, striving for strategic equidistance when faced with conflicting interests. Our path has rarely been linear. Usually it entails a fair share of zigzagging and muddling through. Without this robust strategic direction or vision, the European Union has historically sought to trade away any differences. For a while, our foreign policy was driven by a mercantilist Germany, which saw economics as the road to our desired strategic autonomy. Significantly, the term mercantilism with a K-E-A was coined to describe the prioritization of Berlin's geoeconomic interest under Angela Merkel, the Chancellor. This thinking dates back to Chancellor Willy Brandt, 1962, the Ostpolitik and the long-standing policy of Wandel durch Handel, change through trade. With respect to Russia, our approach was incongruent, with Europe's eastern members repeatedly sounding the alarm, while Berlin, Paris, London, and Madrid, and Rome looked the other way. Germany, and Germany leads, continued to bet on economic engagement. Since the return of war to European soil, our approach to security has changed drastically. The decision to provide for the first time ever arms and other lethal assistance, along with our newfound resolve to meet NATO's defense spending policy of 2% of the GDP, are steps in the right direction. But that will not be enough. Aside from the immediate challenge of weaning the continent of Russian gas, important work remains to consolidate and strengthen the European Union as a geopolitical actor, and to keep together and to keep the pace. Aligned with the EU, although not always, is the ambivalent leader, the United States. The US has long-standing history of indecision about its global leadership. Washington has alternated between idiosyncratic magnanimity and the harsh selfishness of realpolitik. And this internal struggle dates back to the country's refusal to enter the League of Nations, even though it was instrumental, it was the brainchild of America. And this, in my opinion, is a date that we can keep as the origin of this foreign policy ambivalence of the United States that is there, present all the time. The US led the creation of the current international order and has been at the helm as its defining actor for decades. But it has also frequently fallen into the cynical trap of isolationism. Starting in the Obama years, there were signs that the US was entering such a cycle. Under his leadership, the US began a period of drawing back, of leading from behind, of red lines disappearing, and so on and so forth that you know very well. It is, of course, not to downplay the damage induced by the following administration. The 45th Commander-in-Chief discredited, I'm sorry to say that, but discredited the presidency of the United States, the bedrock of the international system. At his prompting, the country entered a period of seclusion. America first became America alone. Trump's rejection of multilateralism, undermining of the international institution, weakened, in fact, the US image and eroded US credibility. Since the shakeup of February 24, America has renewed its global investment. But even if transatlantic collaboration is exemplary in the war in Ukraine, America is now seen as less reliable by the rest of the world, including Europeans. In spite of the America is back messaging coming from the White House, the US is no longer the leader it once was. Its agency has been structurally diminished by the shifting sands of a fractured society that hardly responds to the "we the people" referenced in the preamble of your much admired Constitution. And this is a concern that transcends America. For the US, whether it wants it to be or not, is still the indispensable nation and will remain so for the foreseeable future. Russia has been instrumental in this fracturing, in line with its role as strategist of disruption. The crisis in Ukraine has dispelled any doubts about Moscow's intention, although quite frankly, Putin has been forthright about his ambitions for years. Undisputably, Putin's metamorphosis over the course of his tenure has been drastic. That, or he was biding his time and playing us. In 2001, just a year after he was first elected president, in a speech before the German Bundestag, he painted Russia as, I quote, a friendly European nation, end of quote, explaining that, I quote, stable peace on the continent is a paramount goal for our nation, end of quote. He went on to claim, quote, the key goal of Russia's domestic policy is first and foremost to ensure democratic rights and freedoms, end quote. Later speaking of, quote, large-scale and equal pan-European cooperation, end of quote. You will agree, read today, this would be laughable were it not for the lives lost and the brutality that he is showing. Even more outlandish in light of the current event were his comments on an NPR special program in the same year with the catchy title of Putin Speaks to America. When asked about the possibility of the Baltics entering NATO, he replied, I quote, we of course are not in a position to tell people what to do. We cannot forbid people to make certain choices if they want to increase the security of their nation in a particular way, end of quote. As his presidency progressed, Putin's spirit of cooperation dulled. his strategy began to rely increasingly on aggression, both domestically, with his crackdown on oligarchs being paramount, and in terms of foreign policy. His rhetoric became more combative. His desire to highlight commonalities with Europe vanished. In its place, he constructed a staunchly anti-Western narrative fundamental to the country's raison d'etre. His litany of grievances, instances of Russia being deliberately wrong, were squarely attributed to the transatlantic alliance, starting with dissolution of the Soviet Union, which in 2005 he called, I quote, the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. He spun a tale of humiliation that conveniently allowed for domestic failures to be overlooked, as he styled himself as the nation's savior. The war in Ukraine is the materialization of his vision, repeated around the world by the Kremlin's propaganda machine, to impose cultural uniformity and deny the existence, history, and identity of Ukraine, an argument which is gaining greater momentum in the isolated echo chamber of the Russian society. His contempt for the West and disparagement of the international liberal order has increasingly sought to exploit what he views as American and European strategic disarray, both internally and in relation with each other. His now infamous speech at the Munich Security Conference in 2007 was paradigmatic. He decried, and I quote, the unipolar world as, I quote, anti-democratic, as well as the, I quote, disdain for the basic principles of international law, end of quote, which in his view the US exhibited. He criticized what he considered to be the build-up of NATO troops on Russian borders and the expansion of the alliance as, I quote, serious provocation that reduces the level of mutual trust, end of quote. And he reminded listeners that, quote, ensuring one's own security is the right of any sovereign state, end of quote. I saw firsthand that no one in the audience, because I was there, no one in the audience believed his intervention was any more than a show of bravado. We willingly dismissed it for years as an outburst of rhetoric. We chose not to understand his words for what they were, a naked manifestation of ambition to remake the security order which he claims has worked against Russia. Now Beijing has been the great beneficiary of this order. Today, it has morphed into the smooth operator per excellence, a skillful organizer of rules and institutions with a vocation for manipulation. Its entry in 2001 into the World Trade Organization marked a turning point in the international dynamics of globalization, an entry which notably was made possible by the political will of the United States using the same logic as the German Ostpolitik of approximation via economic relations. Yet, rather than opening up, the Chinese government has asserted deeper control over society, of which trampling democratic rights in Hong Kong and oppressing minorities in Xinjiang are just but two examples. President Xi Jinping, with the support of almost 100 million human terminals who, along with the technological apparatus, constitute the Chinese Communist Party, aspire to reshape the global system according to proclaimed principles of efficiency, and I'm quoting here, efficiency, community, and economic security, countering the, I quote, chaos of democracy. She proposes a model rooted in the order provided by hierarchy, and in spite of his loud objections to hegemony, his goal is clearly to play a leading role in the coming world order. His vision for the future of his country is clear. In stark opposition to liberalism and its tenets, he portrays the path of the party and the state as inextricably linked. He defends the inalienable nature of the CCP's, the China Communist Party, right to rule, explaining that the health of China depends on the survival and success of the party. While Russia has never shielded away from changing the international legal order, Beijing's approach has been more subtle, more nuanced. it has worked to gradually gain power from within the existing structure and then to shape it in its image. For too long, we looked the other way, as we did with Russia, as Beijing sought to overtake the multilateral system. While rarely openly hostile, she has used the public podium to wrap himself in the fold of false multilateralism, claiming democratic tradition based on, I quote, unique cultural characteristics, end of quote, and viewing terms such as democracy, quote, with meaning that reflects China's worldview. We see this approach on full display in the present crisis. China is leading the debate on Russia's aggression against Ukraine, albeit passively. It has proclaimed neutrality, although with an undeniable proclaiming bias. This Switzerland status, between inverted commas, has opened the way for those who try to describe the war as one that is not of their concern, one which they don't want to be involved. Beijing presents an alternative to the West approach to international relations. Rather than focusing on the individual and freedom, the Chinese model is centered around the collective and security, a model which we must admit is gaining traction among those amenable to authoritarianism. A key challenge we face is, therefore, the impact and allure of Beijing vision on our fifth group of actors, the system renewers, nations that demand an updated world order and denounce the alliances / coalitions / competitions that are forming as evidence of a non-order that is emerging. Faced with the ideological struggle between the West and China, they refuse to choose sides. They call for a seat at the table that reflects their relevance, for a system that takes into account the realities they represent. India would be the natural leader of this group. However, New Delhi's inability to translate its demographic advantage into geopolitical terms or to match the economic success of its neighbor to the north has held it back. India's limited projection questions the, until now, uncontested superiority of liberal democracy over all other forms of government and bolsters the arguments of autocracy in Indian society. The appeal of Western-style democracy no longer holds unconditional sway in New Delhi. The country's vision of itself and of its relations to others is far more complex. India has grown closer to the United States in recent decades, more so in light of the ascension of China, an ally of New Delhi's bitter rival, Pakistan. This strengthening of ties is exemplified by the conformation of the Quad, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, but India walks a fine line of cozying up both to the US and Russia. It has sought at all costs to avoid having to make a choice between the two. The country ties to Moscow go back to Soviet assistance in 1971 during the War for the Liberation of Bangladesh. This relationship is multifaceted and spans the energy and defense industry. The two countries have a history of extensive cooperation in nuclear power, oil, and arms trade. Today, 60% of India's defense hardware and 85% of its spare parts and practically all its transfer of technology hardware come from Russia. This all helps to explain the hashtag I stand with Putin, which has been trending in Indian social media. There is no question that the first four group of actors will be decisive in the remodeling of the world order, but the key to the new design significantly will lie, in my opinion, with the renewers. And with this I conclude. Overwhelmed by the horror of the scenes from Ukraine, we find it is difficult to think beyond the immediacy of the conflict. But we cannot afford to stay trapped in this loop of outrage and melancholy. This war marks a change of era. We are already seeing the world of tomorrow taking shape. It is time to determine what role we will play moving forward. First, we need to be clear-eyed about what is possible. We cannot turn the clock back. The world has changed in many ways. The traditional values and principles that underpin the international liberal order, we so painstakingly sculpted, have been eroded. We have to accept that. We have made mistakes which our adversaries claim prove the lack of commitment to the laws we cherish and defend. Furthermore, neither the US nor the EU holds today the global sway we once did. We no longer make the rules by ourselves. That being said, we need to avoid the very real danger of apathy of disengagement. We are still significant actors, joined by shared values and ambitions which resonate universally, and by a vision for the future based on liberal democracy. It is critical that we capitalize on the current cohesion and momentum in transatlantic cooperation, that we present ourselves with a united front as we face the increasingly existential challenges of tomorrow. Concretely, the alternative being pushed by Russia and backed by China. Importantly, the Euro-American alliance will not be able to counter this actor alone. The system cannot be modified without broad participation. In addition to negotiating with China and working towards a realistic understanding with our complex Russian neighbor, because although these are currently controversial ideas, they will be necessary, we must attract the renewers. It is imperative that we forge an honest dialogue with these actors to chart a course that goes beyond trying to glue the fraying strands of the fragmented liberal order. Rather, we must envision meaningful and reforms adapted to the realities of today. The urgency of this moment and its implications for the future of the world order call for a serious, robust, and unified response. We need to recover the basic concept of citizenry and the rights and obligations, responsibilities it entails. This is core of democracy. It is the front line of our fight against authoritarianisms and populisms. We need clear ideas, firm conviction, openness to compromise, and the will, both political and popular, to survive. This sounds like a hyperbolization. Those fighting in Ukraine prove that it is not. So I end up with this reflection. We run the risk of losing our voice and our ability to shape the remodeling of the global system. Entrenching ourselves in outdated or obsolete positions would mean the end of our relevance. Inaction is simply not an option. Thank you.
Okay. You went a little bit into the question of energy. And, one of the illusions of Putin was that because he controlled the energy markets for gas, not completely in Europe, but substantially, that he could neutralize Europe in any conflict in Ukraine, which he obviously made a mistake on, thank heaven. Can you talk a little bit more about that? I mean, what is Europe doing now to get off the addiction of Russian gas?
Well, first, thank you, and allow me to frame this question, because there have been one major move by your foreign policy, your American foreign policy, which was you went from having an energy policy that was exclusively security of supply to a policy where you not discover, but you assess that energy was a strategic foreign affairs tool. And therefore, it is fundamental that you are shipping LNG. Right now, you are the first LNG provider in Europe, and in Spain we know it very well because we have a flotilla of LNG terminals, more than anyone in Europe, but Germany is building 2 LNG terminals. And you are asking me about German and how Germans can make themselves free from this addiction to Russian gas. My honest response is that they have very little alternative right now until they build these 2 LNG terminals and until they secure other sources, other origins, because gas, first, it's not a real commodity. You need too much of an infrastructure. It's not like coal or even oil. It's easier. Gas, you really need infrastructure. So in the first days after the invasion, there were very strong declarations by Chancellor Scholz saying that they would decrease immediately their dependence on Russia. But then they have toned down because, in fact, the health of their industry, or at least the electricity-intensive industry that they have, is based on this agreement with Russia to have very conveniently priced gas. If they had to buy gas today on the spot market, even counting on this fundamental change that LNG brings, it's extremely expensive. Their competitiveness would suffer, their economy would suffer. So it's not easy. It's not an easy issue, and they are trying to just muddle through as a very European response.
I know there are very large gas deposits in the Adriatic off the coast of Greece. There are some south of Crete in Greek territorial waters, and also in the Aegean. And Greece has signed an agreement with Israel and Egypt to avail themselves of this. And the Turkish government, of course, says that they're their fields, and they have sent their navy in to prevent any access to this. The last time it happened, thank heaven, Macron, the French sent their fleet in saying, don't do that again.
And send a frigate, and they were just bordering a
war.
A conflict, at least, let's put it aseptically. But my impression is that this is slowly evolving because Turkey is evolving. Turkey is also facing a complicated situation, and Erdogan is much more amenable to consider European Union, which at a certain moment he was not. It was all about the neo-Ottomanism and this idea of being in itself and just having the cake and eat it as well with respect to the European Union.
Yes. Do you think that this newfound unity within NATO is going to continue? If this war continues for months or even years, which it could, do you think that the NATO will begin to fracture?
I'm very worried about the support. Of course, the member states, so Poland, the Baltics, the member states that were under the Warsaw Pact or were part of the Soviet Union, as the Baltics were, they will stand there and they will keep their commitment. But in the South, you know, we are starting to perceive the unwanted consequences, and we have spiking prices, increasing inflation, and we don't have a tradition. In Spain, Russia is a mix of Dr. Zhivago and Tchaikovsky. This is the impression that Spaniards have. And Italians, it's even, I would say, more pronounced. The idea that, of course, we need to have. So, to be clear, this is my main concern: is how we will stand together and committed if this goes on and the sanctions just come to bite us, and they will. And this is a difference with you, United States, is the sanctions will bite us, the ones that have a network, the Spanish producers that had in Russia a big export market, and I'm speaking about an area that I know well. I mean, it will be complicated to just have the same position. But I hope that, that this recover pride, this recover idea that it's worth, that freedom doesn't come for free, and that you may have to fight for this freedom, and that we are in it together, stands. I will do my best, and I think that there are many that will be committed, but in terms of policies and in terms of, you know, it's going to be complicated. And again, I mean, the U.S. leadership has been providential. I mean, the U.S. leadership, that, if you allow me an anecdote, we Europeans, we didn't believe that, because this is another very intelligent move that we had, is to publish the main lines of your intelligence about Putin's intention to invade Ukraine. And I was speaking with a EU ambassador in Kiev on February 22nd. He told me, well, I'm desperate because I think they are right. I have spoken with my friends in America. I think they are right, but my government doesn't allow me to evacuate. So you Americans, you evacuated the non-essential people because you knew. The Europeans were saying, oh, these are fantasies about the Americans, and you know what, we cannot, because this will make that Putin understands. So always fence sitting. Okay, well, you have Americans. And this ambassador had, I mean, on his own, or better, on her own, she bought blankets, water, organized a couple of buses, and had to evacuate the people, the Spaniards. This is the Spanish ambassador, after the 24th.
Oh. So there's been just a displacement within 2 months.
Yeah.
A quarter of the population of Ukraine is now displaced, either internally displaced or they become refugees when they've crossed their national border to another country. There are 5 million refugees and 6 million internally displaced people, which this is in 2 months. In Syria, 50% of the country was displaced or refugees, but it took 3 years to do it. So this is on fast forward that this is happening.
Yeah, and
have you had any refugees from Ukraine to Spain?
Of course, they are coming, but the brunt is taken mostly by Poland. I mean, Poland that was controversial among the pundits in the European Union because of internal politics, now is the example of how to bring in refugees. Now, the issue is that Europeans will have to put money on the table to just provide for these refugees. And again, this at the moment when the economy is not going well, this will be another challenge especially for those that are not on the front line. And I don't want to get into this, but it is a very interesting issue. If you, well, not compare, but if you reflect on this Syrian October to December 2015 and beginning of 2016, this Syrian wave of refugees that, by the way, were mainly pushed by Russia to destabilize the European Union. Well, not mainly, no. I mean, Russia had played a role in pushing them, contributing to this wave of refugees. And the present situation. We, of course, Professor Natsios said it, you are blessed. You have two oceans, a very friendly country, and honestly, another neighbor that is not the worst you can have as a neighbor.
No, you're right.
Far from that.
Yes.
Far from that. Sometimes a bit complicated, but in the end, first thing is that in the end, the basic culture, the basic approach is common. It's just it.
And one of the reasons President Bush, in fact, I was at a conference teaching in a seminar for the U.S. military, and the former finance minister of Mexico was there, and he said, I don't think you Americans realize what George Bush did, our George Bush, 41, when he negotiated the NAFTA trade agreement. Because if you look at Mexican foreign policy from the 1840s, the Mexican-American War, until NAFTA, they took almost the opposite position of the United States in everything because of hostility over what happened in the 1840s, until NAFTA. And the finance minister said it was an act of genius by your president to completely reverse that by integrating our economy and the Mexican economy. If you notice the Mexican foreign policy positions since then, they've been far more in line with the United States. And that was not an accident. It was actually, there was a statement made back then by the administration. That is one of the purposes in doing this. It's not just an economic question.
You are so right. I saw President Calderon, and we were exactly discussing this. Yes. And comparing this with the approach that we Europeans took with Ukraine and the situation that we are having, and his experience was exactly this. I fully concur, Ed. I think it was a visionary, and this is the part of it. It's just on the surface is selfish to on the surface it's, what President Bush 41 did was a very good example of this grand vision that is one of the drivers of foreign policy, and he was contested by the other vision, the narrow vision that just sees the interest of the United States as in a very narrow framework.
Let's go back to Putin. Everybody's focused on, for good reason, in my view. Putin has often said that his hero is Joseph Stalin. And while it's controversial in Europe to say this, not so much in the United States, I don't see a lot of difference between Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin. Probably Stalin killed more people than Hitler did because he was in office longer. It was always troubling to me to hear him say things like that. Do you think that we're going to see more atrocities? Putin was talking about anybody who was dissenting from the war as traitors and scum, and he invited them to leave the country.
Well, you know,
are we going to see more repression in Russia?
I personally think that Putinology is an esoteric science. So, frankly, I don't try to understand Putin, but his facts are there. What we are seeing is it's unbelievably brutal what we are seeing, and the declarations. Lavrov made a declaration 2 or 3 days ago saying, well, you know what, Hitler was a Jew, just making the comparison with Zelensky. And
Hitler's father was a Jew.
his father was a Jew. His father.
But he wasn't when he was.
No, of course, but I'm quoting. I'm not saying at all.
I understand, but he did say father.
Yeah, but what I mean by this is that it's exactly the same approach. Is just depriving the adversary of human qualities. It's exactly what Hitler did. And there is a very remarkable speech, although Putin himself has toned down, but there is a remarkable speech where he compares Ukrainian with cockroaches. So, this is really major issue. As I say, I don't want to speculate because this is one of the things that we see today in Europe. Any conversation end up saying, well, I think Putin will, or think Putin thinks. I have met President Putin, and in fact, I have been once head of delegation, so I was sitting with him at the table because Prime Minister Aznar had to stay in Madrid because of a big terrorist attack that we had had. And the only thing is that, I tried to see something in his eyes. I frankly didn't see anything, and honestly, not at all any trace of a soul. It's like a curtain behind his eyes. I think that there are all kinds of speculations. You are reading them that there will be a coup, that he's very sick, and that all this responds to just being at the end of his life. Well, maybe what I think is that we nevertheless have to be prepared to this being, for a long run, or at least for a run that will not stop in not a matter of weeks at all, which we thought at the beginning, frankly.
We had Henry Rousseau here, a prominent French intellectual and journal. Just before you came, he was here for 2 weeks, and he gave 2 talks, one on the French election, and then one, he is in charge, Macron has appointed him as the head of a commission to build a museum to commemorate the victims of terrorism, of terrorist attacks in France. And Henry was, he's one of the great French historians of World War I and World War II. And he made the comparison, I thought it was astonishing, to COVID. Very interesting comparison in World War I. He said they kept saying at the beginning of the war is going to be over in 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And then the 2 weeks would be over, and they'd say, no, just 2 more weeks. And then went on and on and on. And he said the same thing with COVID.
Yeah.
This will be over in a couple of weeks.
That's
2.5 years now, or 2.5 years now. Actually, we're not sure there's going to be another variant. But in any case, I think we're being naive, myself, if we think this is going to be over in a few more weeks. And the other problem is we don't know what's going on inside the Kremlin. It is speculation. We don't know if some of this is disinformation, which I would be spreading if I were Ukrainian intelligence. Yeah. They may be spreading some of this themselves to destabilize, to counter the disinformation of the Kremlin. So it's very difficult to say. The thing we do know is from aerial photographs from our spy satellites, which are really, really excellent. We can tell what's going on the ground to some degree. We can't tell what's going on in the Kremlin, but we can tell it militarily on the ground.
Yeah.
So,
well, it's through World War I. They expected the boys to be back for Christmas. For Christmas in 2014. Can you imagine?
So let me ask a question. You raised it at the beginning. In view of the ambivalence of the United States with respect to international affairs, what must the U.S. do to affirm its commitment to our allies in NATO and the EU and regain the trust that we've lost in recent years? And by the way, you know where I am philosophically and where I've served, but this did not start with Donald Trump. It started during the Obama administration.
Yeah, well, I said
so
you
did say that. You did say that.
I fully agree with you. And what the United States has to do is accept that because of America first, so because of interest, but also because of an interest in a broad sense, you have to lead. I mean, you are an indispensable nation. Frankly, you are, you have been, and you will be for the foreseeable future. So accept it. And yes, shake the Europeans. When people criticize President Trump for NATO, I always remind my interlocutors and in conferences that it was Secretary Gates in 2011 in his farewell speech in Brussels who said, you know what, you have to commit to the 2%. Unless you commit to the 2%, I'm paraphrasing, because he says it in a beautiful way. There will come Americans that do not have this tradition of transatlanticism, and I mean, again, I'm paraphrasing. You cannot have a free ride. You have to understand that this is your security. That this, and it's February 2011. So you are absolutely right. Personally, I insist. I think that what I blame, because in China, President Trump was right. I blame him for undermining the presidency of the United States of America, which is really a cornerstone of the system. Before that, I mean, I would travel the world. People, if you allow my French, would hate the guts of the Americans, but would respect, and in many cases, just fear a bit, but respect the presidency of the United States of America.
I actually, this is a true story. I sat on the governing board, this is 30 years ago when I was in Bush 41 administration at USAID. I was on the governing board of the World Food Program. We were at a meeting in Rome, and the Sudanese government had committed atrocities against their own citizens. And the British and the United States, me and the British ambassador, got up and attacked the Sudanese delegation. And I'll never forget it. We asked for a moment of silence in memory of the people who had been massacred by the Sudanese government, other Sudanese.
Yeah.
And the Sudanese ambassador objected to it. He wanted it struck from the record. He wanted no. I said, to hell with you. We're going to, and we did it. We had a moment of silence. And afterwards, the Sudanese ambassador came up to me. I'll never forget it. And we were extremely hostile to the Sudanese government. Privately, he pulled me aside. He said, you care more about my people than my own government does.
Yeah. And by the way, I mean, I don't want to, but you played a key role in reaching peace in Sudan.
Yes.
You personally and the Bush 43 administration. So this is no other could do that. No other in the world could do that.
People don't know this. President Bush called President Bashir 12 times on the peace agreement because he was backing down. The last week before Bashir signed the peace agreement ending the North-South civil war, the intelligence service in Khartoum said, don't go and sign the agreement to the president of Sudan. And he wasn't going to go. And President Bush called him 3 times in 1 week, and he said, you get on that plane, and you go to Nairobi, and you sign that agreement like you agreed to.
And he did.
And he did.
Yeah.
He did.
This is where this is leadership. And this is what, if America doesn't do it, nobody can do it. And you can do it, but as I say, it's not easy, and I understand. But again, it's like NAFTA. It is in the interest of the United States of America. And frankly, I don't have to prove my Atlanticist credentials because this is my life. I mean, I fell in love with this country the first time I set foot here. Yeah, it is. That's true. And I must say that it was, you allow me, it's 1 minute. 1 minute I take. I came to the United States to work at a very posh summer camp in Vermont. It was very complicated, but I had no money. I mean, I came in in one of the first charter flights that I think ever existed. And I landed in New York 2 o'clock in the morning. And of course, I had to take the bus. There was no bus, and I was in a corner. Honestly, I was 16, and I was in a corner thinking, well, what shall I do? And then this security guy, absolutely American, tall, broad, young lady, what are you doing here? I said, well, you know, I have to wait. And he took, oh, come with me. And he took me to a room where they had this American beverage that you call coffee. And I just, and, you know, and he let me sleep on the floor, but you know, I was 16, I could sleep anywhere. And then he waked me up at 6 o'clock and put me in the bus, which was for me was a kind of challenge, finding the bus, you know, first time you come here. I thought, this is my country, and I went to New York. I remember New York, 7 in the morning, walking up Madison Avenue to go to Central Station, and remembering the films that you see with the white paper, you know, and I thought, well, this is great. Everything was big. I mean, the security.
Not as big as Texas, though.
No, of course. I mean, Texas was another discovery because I owe my life to Texas. I'm a survivor thanks to a fantastic institution that you have, that is MD Anderson Cancer Center. I owe my life to. And for me, Houston, because it was mostly Houston is life. I love Houston. And Texas is fantastic. I don't know it as well as I would like to, but it's the Lone Star. It's great.
Some people in Texas don't think New York is really part of the United States. You know?
Well, you know, sometimes I would agree. Why? Because New York, not all New York, but in the East Coast, you have many that are going European, and this is bad. Honestly, don't go European. Yeah. Don't go European.
I agree with you.
We really need the world. We need you the way you are. Sometimes making big mistakes, by the way, but the way you are, of drive, of commitment, of this idea of future, this idea of the flag. I love when I come to the United States, and even in Texas, with the two flags everywhere. This is the America that, as I say, I fell in love the first time I came.
So I have one last question, Ana, because we're late. We're over
Sorry.
now. And this is a very interesting question because political scientists don't like to think that individual personalities have any effect on history. It's all basic, the structure of the international system or domestic trends and all that. Winston Churchill was irrelevant. We still would have won the war. Do you think things would be different now if there was a different leader in Moscow or a different leader in Kiev?
Well, frankly, I would highlight the leader in Kiev. He's really fantastic. I mean, he has created this unity. I mean, he's doing fantastically well in projecting in the world. So I don't think that this would be the same without Zelensky. Positive. Now, unfortunately, I would say that probably things would not be very different with other leaders in the Kremlin, because it's not just Putin. Let's be clear. This is not Putin's war. This goes well beyond Putin, and this responds to a way of doing things. But Zelensky, he has stature. But then, you know, you mentioned Churchill, and what we are doing with Ukraine is exactly the land and lease, or much more, but the same approach of the land and lease before you got into World War II. I hope, for the sake of all of us, that it will be the Ukrainians that will manage to stop and bring Russians back to where they belong. But there are many similarities. I think that we are at an end of a cycle. Unfortunately, America has been, and you know as well as I do that it was reluctantly. United States has been centered on the Indo-Pacific And frankly, I mean, I didn't want to mention AUKUS, but this was quite a blow for us Europeans, this agreement that they reached with Australia for just to build in the United States the nuclear submarines without even telling the French that had a previous agreement with Australia to do the same thing. Of course, this was concocted by our friends from United Kingdom, and they were playing their own game with the European Union. But it's again, it's the America back carrying of European security, with European security being, being really at stake, and European security meaning the transatlantic security and meaning our system. And again, I haven't in the printed version. There are. I have a fantastic, very telling quotes from Lavrov and from Putin, just explaining how they want to destroy this world order, because it is in their panorama, and how and why President Xi of China just concurs, playing the smooth operator, as I said.
One concluding comment that for me was the end. When I saw this, I've always been suspicious of the Russians, but not the Russian government, not the Russian people or culture, but George Washington University, computer scientists in the business school, and the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, one of the finest in the world, did a joint research project on Twitter messaging against vaccines before COVID. This is before COVID. You know where massive numbers were coming from? The Kremlin.
Of course.
They were spreading anti-vaccine movement conspiracy theories. It's the Illuminati trying to poison all of us, the Illuminati conspiracy from the French Revolution. Bizarre. If you get vaccinated against smallpox or measles, you'll be sterile, for example. These were messages from the intelligence service in Moscow. And then Putin couldn't understand why no one was getting vaccinated in Russia.
Yeah.
They were reading their own propaganda and apparently believing it. Why? That's a nihilistic thing to do. We eliminated smallpox during the Cold War. The only thing we cooperated, well, not the only thing, but one of the few things we cooperated with the Soviet Union on was eliminating smallpox. It was decided in 1958. Our scientists were their scientists. The one thing we're going to cooperate, and guess what? There's not been one single instance of smallpox since 1976. There's one disease, human disease, we've completely wiped out. And it's because we work with the Russians. The current regime in Moscow would be an embarrassment to the communists. And I don't like the communists. But spreading rumors about vaccines, one of the reasons we have vaccine hesitancy for all vaccines in Africa now is because of this Russian propaganda. In fact, we've initiated a whole project on the source of vaccine hesitancy in Africa through the Scowcroft Institute. We're studying this right now. Anyway, thank you, Ana, for coming. It's been a delightful evening. We appreciate it very much.
Thank you.